Some mornings you wake up and realize your life's been a lie, and the coffee you're clutching isn't strong enough to wash that truth down. That was me, Riley Voss, 32 years old, sitting in my sun-drenched kitchen in suburban Portland, Oregon, staring at a text message that ripped the floor out from under me. It was 7:32 a.m., the kind of crisp March morning where the rain had paused just long enough to let the light spill through my giant living room window, all 8 feet of pristine glass that I'd spent months designing into this house. My house. The one I'd bought with $4,500 of my own money, scraped together over 8 years of freelancing as a graphic designer. I was sipping from my favorite mug, the one with caffeine is my muse scrawled in bold Helvetica, when Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. He'd left it behind, something he never did, and I reached for it, thinking I'd call him to swing back before he hit the freeway. That's when the screen lit up with her name. Savannah. The message glowed like a neon warning sign. Don't worry, I found a buyer for the house. Once we transfer the money, Hawaii's ours. My stomach dropped, a cold, heavy thud like I'd swallowed a brick. I read it again, my thumb hovering over the screen, willing the words to rearrange into something that made sense. Hawaii? A buyer for the house? This house? My house? The one with my name and only my name on the deed? I set the mug down hard, coffee sloshing over the rim, staining the white quartz counter I'd picked out after 3 trips to the showroom. Ethan had kissed me goodbye not 10 minutes ago, his lips warm against my forehead, his 6-foot frame filling the doorway in that gray suit I loved. "See you tonight, babe," he'd said, flashing that smile that hooked me 2 years ago at an art fair downtown. Now that smile felt like a mask, and this text was the crack splitting it open. I'm not the kind of person who panics. I'm Riley Voss, the woman who once stayed up 48 hours straight to redesign a client's billboard campaign after they changed their mind at the last second. I thrive on chaos. I turn it into art. My friends call me sharp, maybe a little too sarcastic, the type who'd say, if life's a design project, I just found out someone's been screwing with my color palette. But this wasn't a client screwing me over. This was my husband. The man I'd married 3 months ago in a quiet ceremony by the Willamette River with 20 guests and a playlist I'd curated myself. Ethan Caldwell, banker by day, charmer by life, who'd moved into my dream home with nothing but a few cardboard boxes and promises of forever. And now, apparently, he was selling it out from under me. I stood up, pacing the hardwood floor I'd spent weeks sanding to a perfect golden sheen. The house stretched out around me, 2,500 square feet of open space I'd built from scratch. The walls were still bare, waiting for the prints I'd been meaning to hang, and the backyard beyond that big glass window was a blank slate where I'd pictured a garden, maybe some basil and rosemary to go with my terrible cooking. I'd poured everything into this place, every late night hunched over my laptop, every dollar from contracts I'd fought tooth and nail to win. Last month, I'd landed a gig with a local ad agency, a $1,000,000 paycheck that cleared the final mortgage payment. This was my canvas, my sanctuary, and Ethan knew that. So why was some woman named Savannah texting him about buyers in Hawaii? I grabbed my own phone, fingers trembling as I scrolled through our last messages. "Love you," he'd sent yesterday, with a stupid heart emoji. I'd replied with a coffee cup icon, my usual shorthand. Nothing hinted at this, but then I remembered the little things, the ones I'd brushed off. How he'd been on his phone more lately, always angling the screen away. How he'd asked last week, casual as anything, "Hey, Ree, what's this place worth now, like 500 grand? I'd laughed, told him real estate wasn't my thing, and he'd dropped it with a shrug. Now, those moments glowed red in my memory, warning lights I'd been too blind to see. I sank back into the chair, Ethan's phone still in my hand. My mind raced, pulling up every design principle I knew. Contrast Ethan's easy charm against this betrayal. Balance, The life I thought we had versus the one he was apparently planning. I could smell the coffee cooling on the counter, that dark, bitter scent I lived for, but it couldn't ground me now. I thought about my parents, how Dad walked out when I was 12, leaving Mom with a shitty apartment, and me with a fear of being left behind. I'd sworn I'd never let anyone control my life again, built this house as proof. With Ethan, I'd let my guard down, handing him the keys to my world. And he was cashing them in. I could call him and demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the designer in me, the part that needed to see the whole picture before I made a move. Or maybe it was the girl who'd watched her mom cry over a man who didn't deserve her tears. Either way, I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. I set his phone back on the counter exactly where he'd left it and wiped the coffee spill with a paper towel. My hands were steady now, my breathing slow. If Ethan thought he could sell my life out from under me, he didn't know who he was dealing with. I'd spent years turning chaos into beauty. This was just another project, and I'd be damned if I let him ruin the design. Outside, the Portland sky was graying up again, raindrops tapping the glass like they were knocking to come in. I stared at that window, my reflection faint against the clouds. "Let's see what you're hiding, Ethan," I whispered to no one. The day had just begun, and I had a feeling it was about to get a whole lot messier. The rain had started up again, a steady drizzle smacking against that big glass window as I stood in my kitchen. Ethan's phone still lying there like a loaded gun I didn't dare touch. My reflection stared back at me, distorted in the wet streaks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the Riley Voss I'd built over 32 years was about to unravel. That text from Savannah, with its promise of Hawaii and a buyer for my house, buzzed in my skull like a glitch I couldn't debug. I needed answers, but confronting Ethan straight off felt too reckless, like handing a client a half-finished logo and hoping they'd fill in the blanks. No, I had to dig deeper, figure out the full scope of this mess he'd dragged me into. My coffee was cold now, the mug abandoned on the counter, but I didn't care. I grabbed my keys, my laptop, and a jacket, the kind of beat-up denim thing I wore when I needed to feel tougher than I was, and headed out into the Portland gray. First stop was Meera Patel, my best friend and the only person I trusted to tell me I was being an idiot without making me feel like one. Her bakery, Meera's Sweet Haven, sat 2 miles down the road in a strip mall off Sandy Boulevard, a little brick box with a neon sign that flickered "Open" in pink cursive. I parked my beat-up Toyota hatchback, the one I'd nicknamed the Mule for hauling me through every deadline crunch, and pushed through the glass door. The bell jangled, and the smell of cinnamon and sugar hit me like a hug I didn't deserve. Meera was behind the counter, her black hair tied up in a messy bun, wearing a purple apron over a t-shirt with a glittery unicorn that said, "Believe in Magic." She was 31, a year younger than me, but had this way of seeing through people that made her seem older. She looked up from piping frosting onto a cupcake, her brown eyes narrowing as I shuffled in, dripping wet and probably looking like I'd just lost a fight with a lawnmower. "Riley, what the hell?" she said, setting the piping bag down. "You've got that client canceled the contract face, but worse. Spill it." I slid onto a stool at the counter, the vinyl squeaking under me, and pulled out my phone to show her a screenshot of the text I'd snapped before leaving. Her eyebrows shot up as she read it, and she let out a low whistle. "Hawaii? With some chick named Savannah? I told you Ethan was too slick, like a donut with too much glaze. You didn't listen." She wasn't wrong. Meera had pegged him from day one, back when he'd charmed me at that art fair with his easy laugh and a sketch he'd bought off me for $50. She'd said he was too polished, but I'd chalked it up to her general distrust of men after her own string of bad dates. Now, I wished I'd paid attention. "I need to know what's going on," I said, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. "He's talking about selling my house, Meera. My house. The one I paid for with every late-night gig and ramen dinner. She nodded, grabbing a cupcake from the tray, chocolate with a swirl of ganache, and slid it across to me. Eat this first. You're no good to me starving and freaking out. Then tell me everything. I took a bite, the sweetness cutting through the bitter knot in my chest, and spilled it all. The text, Ethan's casual questions about the house's value, the way he'd been glued to his phone lately. Mira listened, her lips pursing tighter with every word, until she finally said, "We're hacking his email. Right now. I've got a hunch, and my hunches are never wrong." Back at my place, we set up in my home office, a corner room with a desk littered with sketch pads and a monitor I'd splurged $800 on last year. Mira perched on a stool, cracking her knuckles like a cartoon villain, while I logged into Ethan's Gmail. His password was still Ethan123, a detail so dumb I almost laughed, except laughing felt impossible right then. The inbox loaded, and there it was. A thread with Savannah Lay, time-stamped over the past 2 weeks. Hotel receipts for $300 at a boutique spot downtown, 10 miles from here. Messages about finalizing the deal and moving the funds. My hands shook as I clicked through, landing on an email from yesterday. Buyers offering $500K. Papers are ready. Meet me tonight at the Rusty Anchor to celebrate. The bar's name hit me like a slap. I knew it. A dive off Burnside where the hipsters and suits mingled over cheap whiskey. Ethan had said he was working late tonight. Yeah, right. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my keys again, Mira trailing me with a, "You're not going alone, psycho." We piled into the mule, the rain now a full-on downpour, wiper screeching across the windshield as I drove the 10 miles into the city. The Rusty Anchor was a squat brick building with fogged-up windows and neon buzzing beer in red. I parked across the street, my heart hammering so loud I could barely hear Mira muttering about how she should have brought pepper spray. Through the glass, I saw him. Ethan, my Ethan, 6 feet of betrayal in that gray suit, leaning over a high-top table, his arm around a blonde in a red dress. She was tall, all sharp angles and glossy hair, laughing at something he said. I fumbled my phone out and snapped a picture through the window, my hands shaking so bad the first shot was a blur. The second caught them clear as day, his lips brushing her cheek. I dropped the phone into my lap, the cupcake in my stomach turning to lead. "That's her," I whispered. "That's Savannah." Mira grabbed the phone, zooming in. "Holy crap, Ree! She's got homewrecker written all over her. What now?" I didn't answer, just stared at the rain streaking the windshield, my mind racing. But then Mira gasped, shoving her own phone in my face. It was Instagram, Savannah's profile, public and shameless. The latest post, uploaded an hour ago, her standing in front of my house, that big glass window glinting behind her, captioned, "Soon to be mine." My house, my life. I checked our joint bank account next, something I hadn't touched in weeks because Ethan handled the bills. $5,000 gone, withdrawn yesterday. "He's stealing from me," I said, the words tasting like ash. "He's selling my house and stealing from me." We drove back in silence, the rain pounding harder, like it was trying to drown out the noise in my head. At home, I stormed into the office, Mira hovering as I rifled through Ethan's desk. In the trash under a crumpled coffee cup, I found it. A printed contract, my house, listed for $500,000, my signature forged in black ink. I sank to the floor, the paper crumpling in my fist. "He's not just cheating," I said, more to myself than Mira. "He's erasing me." She knelt beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "Then we fight back," she said, her voice steel. "You're Riley freaking Voss. You don't lose." I stood up, the contract still clutched tight, and walked to the living room. The glass window loomed, rain battering it like it wanted in. I'd built this place to be my freedom, my proof I could stand on my own. Now it felt like a cage Ethan was auctioning off. I grabbed a can of green paint from the garage, the one I'd bought on a whim last month, and popped it open. At 1 a.m., With Mira snoring on my couch, I started painting the wall beside the window, wild strokes of emerald slashing through the white. It wasn't a plan, wasn't even art, just rage and grief spilling out. "This is mine," I muttered with every swipe. "Not yours, Ethan. Mine." The rain kept falling, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not until I knew everything. The green paint was still wet on my living room wall when the sun peeked through the curtains. A weak, watery glow that barely cut through the Portland drizzle clinging to the glass. I hadn't slept. Not after finding that forged contract in Ethan's trash. My signature scrawled in someone else's hand like a cheap knockoff of my life. Mira was sprawled on the couch, her unicorn shirt wrinkled, snoring softly as the clock hit 6 a.m. I stood there, staring at the emerald streaks I'd slashed across the wall at 1 a.m., my hands still flecked with paint, the can kicked over in the corner. It wasn't art, not even close, just a scream in color, a promise to myself that this house, my house, wasn't slipping away without a fight. But I needed more than paint. I needed proof, a way to nail Ethan to the wall harder than I'd nailed that contract to my resolve. That's when Jasper Torres, my rough-around-the-hedges neighbor, knocked on my door and handed me the key to everything. Josh showed up unannounced, his 38-year-old frame filling the doorway, rain dripping from his dark hair onto a faded Metallica t-shirt stretched over broad shoulders. He held a small metal sculpture in his calloused hands, a bird breaking free from a cage, intricate and jagged, the kind of thing he'd been leaving on my porch since he moved in a month ago. "Saw you come home last night," he said, his voice low, gravelly, like he didn't waste words. "Looked like hell. Thought you might need this." I took the bird, its sharp edges biting into my palm, and almost laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Hell's an understatement, yes. Ethan's selling my house out from under me, with some blonde named Savannah." His hazel eyes flicked to the painted wall behind me, then back to me, steady and unreadable. "Check your backyard," he said. "Caught him messing around out there last week. Looked like he was hiding something." I didn't wait for Mira to wake up. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the cheap plastic one I kept for power outages, and bolted outside, Jazz trailing me through the rain-soaked grass. The backyard stretched 50 feet behind the house, a muddy patch I'd meant to turn into a garden, but hadn't touched since moving in. I scanned the space, the beam cutting through the gray dawn, until I spotted it. A potted fern by the fence, its leaves drooping like it hadn't been watered in weeks. Something about it felt off, too staged, and when I kicked the pot aside, there it was, a tiny black camera, no bigger than a golf ball, its lens glinting like a snake's eye. "Son of a bitch," I muttered, yanking it free, wires dangling. Jas crouched beside me, his breath fogging in the cold. "Security cam, motion activated. He's been watching you." Back inside, I plugged the camera into my laptop, my hands shaking as the footage loaded. There he was, Ethan, time-stamped 5 days ago, standing in my garage at midnight, talking on his phone. The audio was tinny but clear enough to gut me. "She doesn't suspect a thing," he said, his voice smug, the one I used to love. "I've moved 500,000 offshore already. Once the sale closes, we're gone." I froze the frame, his face lit by the garage bulb, that gray suit wrinkled like he'd worn it too long. $50,000. Not just the 5,000 from our joint account, but a chunk he'd siphoned from somewhere else. My somewhere else. I checked my personal savings online, the one I'd kept separate, and sure enough, 45000 was missing, withdrawn in chunks over the past month. He'd hacked me, used my trust to bleed me dry. Mira woke up then, stumbling into the office with bedhead and a yawn. "What's with the war paint?" she said, nodding at my hands, then saw the screen and went quiet. "That's our smoking gun," she said finally, her voice hard. "You've got him, Ree. Now what?" I didn't answer right away. I sat there, the bird sculpture still in my lap, its metal warming against my skin. Ethan would be home soon, expecting me to be the oblivious wife, sipping coffee while he sold my life to Savannah. Not today. I'm ending this, I said, standing up. Tonight, in the kitchen where it started. I spent the day prepping, a designer laying out her final draft. Mira helped me print the footage stills, the contract, the bank records, and every damning piece stacked on the counter like a portfolio of betrayal. Jazz stayed too, silent but solid, rigging the camera feed to loop old footage so Ethan wouldn't know we'd found it. By 6 p.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. I stood in the kitchen, the green wall glaring behind me, wearing the same denim jacket from yesterday, my hair a mess but my spine straight. Ethan walked in at 6:15, loosening his tie, that smile flickering when he saw me waiting. "Hey, babe," he said, tossing his keys on the counter. "Rough day?" "Sit down, Ethan," I said, my voice icy, pointing to a stool. "We need to talk about Hawaii and the buyer for my house." His smile faltered just for a second, then he laughed, leaning back like I'd told a joke. "What are you on about, Ree? You've been up all night designing again?" I slid the contract across the counter, my forged signature staring up at him. This, and Savannah, and the $500 you stole. His eyes darted to the paper, then back to me, the charm draining from his face. "You think you're smarter than me?" he said, standing up, towering over me at 6 feet. "I've got this handled. You can't stop it." I didn't flinch. I hit play on my laptop, his voice echoing from the garage footage. "She doesn't suspect a thing, filling the room like poison." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd lunge, but I held my ground. "You're done," I said, pulling out my phone. "I called the cops 5 minutes ago. They're on their way." He laughed again, colder this time. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare." But then the sirens cut through the quiet, red and blue flashing through that big glass window, and his face went slack. I stepped closer, my voice low. "I built this house, not you, me, and you don't get to take it." The doorbell rang, and Mira opened it, 2 officers stepping in, their boots loud on my hardwood. "Ethan Caldwell?" one said, holding up a badge. "We've got a report of fraud and forgery." Ethan spun, pointing at me. "This is my house, too. She's lying." But I handed over the stack of evidence, calm as I'd ever been, and watched them cuff him. His phone rang as they dragged him out, Savannah's name lighting up the screen. I answered, her voice shrill. "Ethan, what's happening?" "Ask him at the station," I said, and hung up. The door slammed shut, and the kitchen went silent, just me and that green wall. The paint still tacky, the air thick with victory. The kitchen was dead quiet after the police hauled Ethan out, the echo of sirens fading into the Portland night, like a bad dream I'd finally woken up from. I stood there, alone, the green paint on the wall behind me still wet, its sharp scent mixing with the stale coffee lingering on the counter. My hands were steady now, no more shaking, but my chest felt hollow, like I'd just run a marathon and forgotten why I'd started. Mira had followed the cops outside, yelling something about justice and cupcakes, while Jas stayed back, leaning against the doorway with that metal bird sculpture still sitting on the table between us. "You okay?" he asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. I looked at him, his ruffled hair dripping from the rain he'd stood in earlier, and managed a nod. "Yeah," I said. Though it didn't feel true yet. I will be. The next few hours blurred into a haze of paperwork and phone calls. The officers took my statement, their pens scratching across notepads as I handed over the forged contract, the camera footage, and screenshots of Ethan's offshore account transfers. They confirmed what I'd already pieced together. He'd siphoned $500 total, $5,000 from our joint account, and $4,500 from my personal savings, using a hacked login I'd stupidly shared months ago for a utility bill. "Fraud, forgery, and theft," one cop said, snapping his notebook shut. "He's looking at 5 to 7 years minimum." I nodded again, numb, watching them bag Ethan's phone, still buzzing with Savannah's panicked calls, and cart it off as evidence. Mira came back inside then, her unicorn shirt soaked, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and defiance. "You did it, Ree," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "You kicked his ass." But kicking his ass didn't feel like winning, not yet. The house was mine again, legally, undeniably, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The big glass window loomed in the living room, reflecting the chaos of the night, and every corner held Ethan's shadow. The counter where he'd left his phone, the garage where he'd plotted, and the bedroom where I'd trusted him. I couldn't sleep that night, even after Mira crashed on the couch again, and Jazz headed back to his place with a quiet, "Call if you need me." I wandered into the backyard instead, barefoot in the damp grass, staring at the spot where that camera had been. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and heavy, and I sank down beside the overturned fern pot, my denim jacket pulled tight around me. "This is mine," I whispered, the same words I'd muttered while painting the wall, but they sounded hollow now, a mantra I wasn't sure I believed. The next morning, reality hit harder. My lawyer, a friend of Mira's named Carla, with a no-nonsense bob and a handshake like a vice, called to confirm Ethan's arrest had stuck. He'd been denied bail, too rattled to charm his way out, and the $500,000 was being traced back to me through a forensic accountant. "You'll get it all back," Carla said, her voice crackling over the phone. "And the house is airtight, your name only. He's got no claim." I thanked her, hung up, and checked out Savannah's Instagram out of some masochistic impulse. Her account was gone, deleted overnight, but a quick Google search showed her real estate license was under review after an anonymous tip, probably mine, leaked the forged contract to her agency. She'd bolted, leaving Ethan to rot, and part of me almost pitied him. I needed to take the house back, not just on paper, but in my bones. That afternoon, I dragged the paint can out again, the green I'd splattered in rage, and started over. Jazz showed up without me asking, hauling a ladder from his garage across the street, his 6'2" frame dwarfing the thing as he set it up. "Thought you might want help," he said, grabbing a roller. We painted in silence, covering every white wall in that living room with bold, messy strokes of emerald, the color swallowing Ethan's ghost. By dusk, the place smelled like a forest after rain, and I didn't stop there. Jazz helped me lug an old table into the backyard, one I'd found in the garage, and we set it up under the string lights he strung across the fence. "For your garden," he said, nodding at the muddy patch. "Or whatever you want," I smiled, a real one this time, and handed him a beer from the fridge. "Thanks, Jazz," I said, clinking my bottle against his, "for seeing me." Mira wouldn't let me wallow either. 2 days later, she showed up with a cardboard box of cupcakes, a bottle of cheap wine, and a plan. "We're throwing a Screw Ethan party," she declared, shoving the box into my hands. "Tonight, my bakery, 7 p.m. Bring your paint-stained self." I laughed, the sound foreign but welcome, and by evening I was there, standing in Mira's sweet haven, surrounded by a dozen people I barely knew. Neighbors I'd waved to but never talked with, a couple of her regular customers, even Jazz, who slipped in late with a six-pack and a nod. The place glowed with fairy lights, the air thick with sugar and laughter, and Mira raised a cupcake like a toast. "To Riley," she said, her voice loud over the chatter, "for kicking a sleazeball to the curb and keeping her badass house." Everyone cheered, and I took a bite of chocolate frosting, letting the sweetness sink in. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter, like the weight of Ethan's lies was lifting. Peace. The backyard became my sanctuary after that. I spent the next week out there, Jess dropping by with tools and quiet company while I built raised garden beds from scrap wood. We planted basil and rosemary, my hands caked in dirt, and he told me about his own escape from a controlling ex years back. Took me a while to figure out I didn't need her permission to live, he said, hammering a nail into place. I nodded, brushing soil off my jeans. I get that now. The house wasn't just walls anymore. It was mine again, every green stroke, every muddy root, and with Mira's laughter echoing from her bakery and J.S.'s steady presence next door, I wasn't alone in it. The glass window still stood, but it didn't trap me now. It let the light in, and I was ready to bask in it. The Portland rain had softened into a fine mist by the time I stood in my backyard, a week after Mira's Screw Ethan party, my hands buried in the cool soil of the garden beds Jazz and I had built. The basil and rosemary were just sprouts, fragile green promises poking through the dirt, but they felt like a beginning, something I'd planted with my own strength. The house glowed behind me, its emerald walls catching the last light of day through that big glass window. No longer a trap, but a mirror, reflecting the woman I'd become. I'd spent the morning in there sketching a new design project on my laptop, a branding gig for a local coffee shop that paid $5,000, enough to replace the savings Ethan had stolen before the courts clawed it back. The air smelled like wet earth and freedom, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling his shadow over me. Ethan was gone, locked up in a cell 20 miles away, his trial set for next month with a laundry list of charges: fraud, forgery, and theft. Carla, my lawyer, called yesterday to say the $500 was officially mine again, wired back into my account, and Savannah's real estate career was toast, her name blacklisted after the scandal hit the local news. I didn't gloat. Didn't even check the articles. That chapter was closed, a smudge on my canvas I'd painted over with green. But closure came with a quiet ache, too. I'd loved him once, built dreams around him, and letting that go left a hollow I wasn't sure how to fill, until Mira and Jazz showed me I didn't have to fill it out alone. That evening, I sat on the back porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, watching the string lights flicker above the garden. Jazz dropped by, his boots muddy from his garage, and handed me another metal sculpture, this one a tiny tree with roots twisting free of a cracked pot. For your new start, he said, sitting beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. We didn't talk much, just sipped our drinks, but his presence anchored me, a reminder that I wasn't rebuilding in a void. Mira texted then, a photo of a new cupcake she'd named the Riley, chocolate with green frosting, captioned, "Badass in every bite." I laughed, the sound echoing across the yard, and texted back a heart. They'd pulled me through, not with grand gestures, but with cupcakes and quiet company, showing me home wasn't just walls, but people who stayed. Looking at that glass window, I saw myself clearer than ever. Messy, stubborn, stronger than I'd known. Ethan taught me love could lie, but it also taught me I didn't need someone else to complete my picture. I was the artist, picking my own colors, and I'd chosen green, growth, and grit. Life's a design, and sometimes you scrap the draft to draw something truer. With Mira's laughter and Jazz's steady hands beside me, I'd found my real home, and that was worth every tear I'd painted over.